Hi, I'm a U.S. Election Assistance Commission Chairman Donald Palmer. And as we continue our interview series on lessons learned from the 2020 election, I'm pleased to be joined with Judge Frank Barger. Frank Barger was elected as the Madison County, Alabama Probate Judge in November 2018 and began his current term in January 2019. Prior to his election, Frank served as a senior staff member of the previous probate judge and as Madison County's election administrator. He's a recognized leader in the probate court system, serving as a board member of the National Association of Election Officials Research Advisory Board, a member of the Secretary of State's Probate Judges Advisory Committee, board member for the Alabama chapter of the National Alliance for Mental Illness, and as a member of the Community Advisory Committee for Wellstone Behavioral Health. Thank you for joining me today, Judge Barger. Thank you for being a part of this series. I usually start off these videos talking about the pandemic and how that affected voting, in-person absentee or absentee on election day or prior to election day. How did the pandemic change the way you voted in Alabama? And what were some of the significant changes that your jurisdiction undertook?
Well, it certainly, it changed our entire cycle. We saw our primary push to a later date. We certainly dealt with issues related to the pandemic and how we prepare for that. It was an interesting cycle, to say the least. I think the biggest challenge that we had were some restrictions were lifted by state leadership on absentee voting and opened that process up to really anyone who had concerns related to the pandemic. And what that did for us is we saw a nearly 300% increase in the number of people that chose to cast a ballot in advance of the election. And, in a typical presidential cycle, we would see around 10,000 absentee ballots requested and close to that same number, of course, processed, returned to us. That number almost hit the 40,000 mark for the general election last year. So that certainly was really the biggest challenge, staffing that. We only have one absentee voting location, as is common in all counties throughout the state of Alabama. So staffing that, managing the crowds and lines related to that, that was a significant part of the challenge that we had for last year, especially around the general election.
So when you speak of absentee voting, that includes not only the mail voting, the absentee mail voting, but also, do you have an in-person absentee process as well?
We certainly do. You can request a ballot by mail. Of course, if you're serving in the military, there's the UACAVA process for that. But you can actually come to the county courthouse, fill out an application, receive your ballot, and return it in real time in advance of the election. That starts roughly 45 days prior to the election date. And as you can imagine, we had a large crowd. The courthouse facility that we are in was not built to accommodate that type of line or crowd. And so we really did we learned something new every day. We constantly shifted how we managed the line, the crowd. And so it certainly was a challenge. There were days that, and our courthouse is in a traditional, if you will, Southern environment where we're in the middle of a square downtown. And so there were days that we had lines wrapped 2 and 3 times around the building. We actually did a very good job, though, with administering it. We had very few complaints. We managed the line very well. We worked the line. So we would go out, ensure that everybody had everything in order, had their application, and would work with them before they made it to the point of getting inside to ensure that things were in order. So we put a lot of measures in place to ensure that we were assisting them as best as we could. Most people were appreciative of the ability to be able to do that and do it with some ease. Of course, we always have folks that complain or have concerns, but for the most part, folks were glad to have the opportunity.
So obviously the pandemic was a big story in 2020 and election administration. What issues did you have in recruiting poll workers or finding polling locations? Across the country, there were some issues with that. What worked with you and what didn't work in addressing those issues?
Well, a couple of things. We're very fortunate that the great majority of locations where we vote were very welcoming to us. They did want to understand what kind of protocol we had in place, what we would be doing throughout the day, how we would clean up after leaving that polling location. But I will say, unlike the majority of communities across the country, we did not have a polling location that refused to serve as a host for us on election day. There were some particulars depending on locations. Many of our polling locations are inside church facilities. They might have a preschool or an education component, a child development component to their organization. So it could be that we had to reroute entry or ingress and egress points in and out of locations, change traffic patterns that we would normally use to avoid a certain area or a section of the campus or the building. But we were fortunate that we were able to make adjustments in all of our polling locations. Due to the increase, especially in the general election, due to the increased turnout that we experienced with absentee voting, we saw lower numbers in some of our precincts where numbers would have been historically high, or we would have had a lot of foot traffic. So that voting in advance did relieve some burden in some locations.
So with the pandemic, was there any issues with voter registrations that you're aware of that may have caused additional provisional ballots or technical issues, anything like that on election day?
I'm not aware that anything specific to the pandemic caused the issue. I couldn't recall, honestly, and I couldn't recall the exact number of provisionals that we had, but I don't recall it being specific to the general election. Don't recall it being an unusually high number or anything out of the norm. Chairman, one thing I didn't answer for you was poll workers. You talked about the difficulty in polling locations and managing those, and I didn't really talk about our poll workers. We are certainly blessed to have the poll workers that we have. The great majority of our poll workers, as I think are probably consistent throughout the country, are older. Many of them are retired. And certainly many of them shared concerns about what kind of PPE and what kind of protocol we would have in place. And I will tell you that we had very few folks refuse to serve. And so we did prepare should we have a group of people affected, because many of these groups of election workers, they might all go to the same church or have the same type of friends group. And so we wanted to be prepared should we have a group of workers that were hit with the pandemic, and a great majority of them couldn't serve. So we did a lot of backup training. We had folks waiting and willing to serve on an emergency basis, but we had less than 24 folks that refused to serve because of the pandemic itself. They were very comfortable with the equipment that we put in place, the protocol we had with social distancing and all the measures that were in place, and I'm grateful for them. And to my knowledge, we did not have any issues related to any health issues related to their service in the process. We certainly couldn't have made it through as well as we did without their support. In Madison County, we have close to 1,000 election workers in a pool that we pull from during an election cycle. And we use somewhere around the 800 or 850 mark in the general election.
So how is voting by mail different in this election? Looking back now, did you see a significant increase in the actual vote by mail? And did you have to put additional resources toward the processing of those ballots?
I think that what we saw, I don't know that we saw a huge increase in vote by mail as much as we did just in-person voting. Some of us kind of stood back and went, well, they don't want to come to their polling location, but they'll come to the courthouse. It's the same situation. But that's what they chose to do. I think that folks were so concerned that we were going to have an issue or something major occur with the health crisis in advance of the election. They didn't want to miss the opportunity to vote. And I feel that's why so many folks turned out in person on the front end. Yes, mail-in was certainly higher, but not exceptionally higher. The great majority of that traffic came from those folks that actually came in person to the courthouse in advance. I don't know that we'll ever see numbers that high again. We'll see. It certainly has changed the way, and will change the way we prepare for absentee voting in the future. And we've had some legislative changes that will impact what voting looks like in Alabama related to absentee in the next cycle. They're not major issues, but it will change certain components of it. It won't change, I think, the number of people that participate, and overall won't change the administration of the process too greatly. But how we set up, the space we use, how we manage those people that vote in person early using the absentee process, we'll certainly be looking at that through a different filter as we prepare for next year.
How would you characterize the performance of the Postal Service? Did they, there was a lot of talk before the election about some concerns, and obviously
A lot of people voted in-person absentee. Did the post office perform, adequately to get those ballots back to you in time?
Well, I always shudder to speak ill of the Postal Service, and my negative remarks are not reflective of our postal workers. We're very fortunate here in Madison County to have a relationship with our hub and with our postal workers that manage things on the ground in person here. But I would say that we overall had performance that was not up to par. There were lots of concerns about folks, especially those that waited until late in the process, about their ballot getting back to us via US mail. One thing that we did, which was very unusual, is we set up drop-off points for absentee ballot return. We did that, and law is very specific in the state of Alabama. It has to be accepted by the circuit clerk, by the person serving as the absentee election manager. And we actually had our circuit clerk of courts, our absentee election manager, in kind of a roving schedule where we would set up a tent, set up a location, do signage, make that available, information available to the media. And we did that throughout all of our commission districts several times so that folks could turn that ballot in person without having to put it back into the mail, because certainly there were concerns about the mail, the US mail performing the way that they should in this process. They were overloaded. And so to be critical of them, we also have to realize that we had an unusually high number of folks that voted by mail across the country, not only in Alabama, but everywhere.
But there was a plan B, and in this case, some of the voters were able to basically bring their ballot to the clerk
Themselves and hand
Correct. They're fully completed, sealed, and ballot, just as if they were ready to put it in the mail. We provided drop-off points for them where our circuit clerk was present herself to accept those. And the last, I want to say week, don't quote me on the exact number of days, but the last week prior to the cutoff for accepting those ballots, you could drive by outside the courthouse where she was present to drop off as well. So we did everything we could within the parameters of the law to provide some relief and give folks options so that we ensured that they had the opportunity to vote, and of course that their vote was counted.
So we've talked a little bit about the changes in 2020 due to the
pandemic and providing those options. Do you think, what will be, you just mentioned some legislation. Do you think that what changes will stay with you to 22 and 24, and what do you see as temporary measures?
I'll be honest, we're in the middle of assessment right now. We are planning right now, of course, for a late May primary. The presidential preference is always earlier, and so our primary will be a little later this year. And so we're already starting to plan for that process. We do a lot of work that the law doesn't require of us. Late this summer, early this fall, we will actually do a training session with all of our inspectors and deputy inspectors for every polling location. We gather, it's a day-long training session. We use that time to go through all of our equipment in an in-depth process. We'll talk about lessons learned last year. And a lot of what we learn in that meeting, in that time with them, will really dictate what we put in place and how we perform in the primary and for all subsequent elections next year. We will probably have, for their comfort, we will probably continue to have PPE available if it is requested. We'll probably have it available for the public if it's requested at a polling location. But I think that things like hand sanitizer, which, by the way, we had in place far before the pandemic required it, there will be certain things that will be part of our process, part of our planning that will continue down the road. So we will see what our election workers tell us when we get to the late part of this summer, early fall, when we meet. And that will really dictate how we perform at a traditional polling location.
So as you plan for 2022, what areas of improvement have you identified in election administration that you're working on and your team is working on to streamline for, future elections?
What area do we see some that we will continue to implement will be how we work or address any line that might exist at a polling location. We used to think that we could, there was some science, I don't know if you'd call it science, but was some thought about the fact that we would always have crowds in the morning, crowds in the middle of the day, crowds at the end of the day. That was not the case last year. We were heavy in the morning, and you had some of our larger precincts that you get behind and they end up having a line for 3/4 of the day. That's certainly frustrating to voters. It's frustrating to us. We want folks to be able to vote quickly and efficiently. And so we didn't experience the heavy, morning, lunch, and evening routine as we normally had. I think folks were concerned about getting their vote, getting the opportunity to vote, and went early in most cases. And so what I anticipate that we'll do in all of our precincts, and we'll have to determine the number of folks that are involved, but we will put workers outside of that precinct. And I shouldn't say outside, but working the line coming in prior to that voter getting to a check-in point to make sure that they have identification, that they're in the right location, if they need to be redirected to the correct location. Doing a lot of that helped last year. We've never had that in place consistently across our precincts. And I think that's something that we could certainly see. We learned a lot about line management and crowd management based on especially the 2020 general election. And I will say overall, though, we had 3 or 4 locations where we had a line the great majority of the day. We had a much better day than I anticipated. You plan for everything, you overthink, and you hold your breath. And if you're a person of faith, you might pray about it. And overall, our 2020 general election day went very, very well.
Well, this is great to hear, and it's great feedback. So is there anything else you'd like to share about the 2020 experience?
Well, I will say that communication is key. We're fortunate to have we have 6 municipalities in Madison County, 2 being very large, Huntsville being the largest, Madison the second largest. The Huntsville-Madison County metro area is now the largest metro area in the state by population. We communicated well, but there was a lot of confusion early in the election cycle on what the governor's order meant in regard to masking. What did a local order mean? Could we require, someone to wear a mask into a polling location? There was lots of miscommunication and concern about that. And I think one thing that we learned as we went through last year was to communicate better with one another. And certainly we learned lessons. There was lots of confusion in the primary regarding personal protective equipment and what was required, what wasn't. And so I think just continued communication will be key as we move forward. It's always been important, but the environment that we were in last year, it was critical. And I think that we have to bring those same people to the table again, even though I think we've certainly turned a corner with the pandemic. Is there anything we need to address prior to getting to our primary in May?
What did you find the best way of communicating?
Well, we used a lot of virtual communication similar to this, but now we are back to, and I'm grateful for it, we're back to sitting around a table with one another when schedule permits. And so, but we did a lot of virtual communication, a lot of communication by email. We also had very proactive government leaders that gave us a brief. I think it was a minimum, don't quote me, I think it was a minimum of twice a week. We heard from one of the mayors of our major cities, as well as the county commission chair on hospitals, where we were with the pandemic. And that also, those numbers, those concerns helped us plan and helped us know if we were doing all we could to protect our workers and protect the public.
Frank Barger, County Probate Judge, Madison County, Alabama, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your commitment to the voters and all your efforts in 2020. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you.
Been my pleasure. I'm honored to have been asked, and I'm glad to be of any help to you all.
Thank you.